Welcome. My name is Craig Hawkins. I am a professional developer with a master's degree in computer science from Brown University. I have many years of development and teaching experience, and I am excited to be your instructor. In this quick start course, you will learn the basics of what JSON is, how it works, and how you can use JSON to serialize and deserialize data. So what is JSON? JSON is a processor for JSON data. It serializes Java objects into JSON and deserializes JSON into Java objects. JSON can also serialize and deserialize XML data, but we will be working exclusively with JSON in this course. Here are some of the key advantages of using JSON. It's fast, lightweight, and open source. It's easy to use and only requires a few lines of code to serialize and deserialize data. Also, JSON can handle complex use cases such as Java objects inside of other Java objects. Let's look at an example of how to use JSON. Here we have a custom Java class named football player. It has two fields, the player's name and the player's number. It also has standard getters and setters. We knew a football player object and populate its fields, but how do we get this Java object information into a JSON string? With a simple call to JSON's API, JSON will convert the field names and values of the Java object into JSON key value pairs and output the result to us as a string. This process is known as serialization. Once the data has been serialized into JSON, we can easily transmit this data over a network. But what if we are starting with a JSON string, and we would like to drive this information into a Java object? With just a few lines of code, JSON will quickly and reliably accomplish this. Converting JSON into Java objects is a process known as deserialization. Complex nested data structures are no problem for JSON. They get handled by JSON with skill and ease. Now we are ready to get started. I am excited to be your instructor throughout the course and hope you enjoy the learning process. By the time you are done with this quick start course, you will have developed a fundamental understanding of how JSON works and how you can use JSON to serialize and deserialize data. When you are done with the course, please be sure to check out my other development courses. Thank you, and let's begin. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to serialize a Java object into a JSON string using JSON's object mapper class. Let's take a look at the details. This import here allows us to use the object mapper class from JSON. This is a very important class, and we will be using it extensively. And we have a class named app. It has a main method. It news the mapper object. And then we new a football player object. And we pass in the data to the football player object. The football player's name is Joe, and his player number is 10. And then what we do is we pass this football player object into mapper's write value as string method. And what that is going to do is serialize the Java object and return the serialization result as a string. And then we're storing it in a variable named JSON string. So let's run this. And we can see we got a nice serialization, name : Joe, number : 10. And the field names in your Java class become the keys in the JSON key value pairs. And there are some rules. JSON wants your fields to either be public and or need to have public getters and setters. So we have fulfilled that requirement here. And also, normally the Java class you are serializing or deserializing would be in a separate file. But so you can see everything on one screen, I put the Java football class in the same file as the app that's driving the overall presentation. In this lesson, we learned how to serialize a Java object into a JSON string using JSON's object mapper. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to serialize a Java object into a JSON file using Jackson's object mapper. Let's take a look at the details. We have a custom Java class here named basketball player. It has two fields, the name of the player and the number of the player. And we have an app here with a main method. And this import here allows us to use the file class. And this import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper. So we knew an object mapper, and then we also knew a basketball player, and we put the data into the basketball player object. And then here is our path that we are going to write to. The name of the file is called outfile.json. And then to write the file, we use mapper.writeValue, and then there are two arguments. The first argument on the left is the path where you want the file written to, and the argument on the right is the object that you are serializing and writing into the file. So let's run this. And when you run it, you might need to hit File, Refresh, and maybe twirl a little bit. My Eclipse IDE can be a little bit fussy sometimes. I find myself sometimes having to coax the presentation of the new file that got written by using file refresh and things like that. So let's take a look at the file that got written. And we can see we have the JSON right there. It is the serialized version of the Java object. Here are the fields of the object, the name of the player, and the number. So we can see name, Tom, number 30. And it was written to a file named outfile.json. In this lesson, we learned how to serialize a Java object into a JSON file using Jackson's object mapper class. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to deserialize a JSON string into a Java object using Jackson's object mapper and its readValue method. Let's take a look at the details. We have a custom Java class here named volleyball player. It's a simple class. It has two fields, name representing the name of the volleyball player and number representing the number of the volleyball player. And we have a Java class named app. This import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper class. This import here allows us to throw an IO exception. And here we have a main method. This is a JSON string right here. We knew an object mapper object. And right here we are newing a volleyball player object. And what we are doing right here is calling mapper.readValue. It takes two arguments. The argument on the left-hand side is the JSON string. And the argument on the right-hand side is the type of Java class that you are trying to drive that JSON data into. In this case, the volleyball player class. So let's run this. And we can see that the deserialization worked properly because when we call player.name, we get Sally, and when we call player.number, we get 20. And it is important to have the JSON key value pairs match properly to the Java object. So since this is name, number, Jackson is going to be looking for fields with the names name and number. So for example, suppose we had this right here, person, Sally. Now we have a mismatch because the JSON string has person, Sally, but volleyball player is expecting name Sally. Let's run this. And we see we get an exception, unrecognized property exception right there. So let me put this back to a matching condition. Now everything matches and Jackson is happy. There are ways around that if you have a mismatch between the key value pairs in your JSON and the names of the fields in your Java object, but that is the topic for another lesson. In this lesson, we learned how to deserialize a JSON string into a Java object using Jackson's object mapper and its read value method. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to deserialize a JSON file into a Java object using Jackson's object mapper and its read value method. Let's look at the details. Here is the in file that we are going to be deserializing into a Java object. It has a name, Joe, and number 20. Volleyball player is the type of object that the data is going to get deserialized into. And here is our app. This import here allows us to use the file object. This import here allows us to throw an IO exception. And this import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper. And let's look at the details here. We have a main method, and then we knew a mapper object. And this is the path of the in file. It's right over there. And right here, we are calling mapper read value. It takes 2 arguments. Right here on the left-hand side, this is the path where the in file is found. This one right here. And this volleyball player.class, that's telling Jackson what type of object to drive the data into. In this case, the volleyball player class. So let's run this. And we can see that the data was deserialized properly because when we call player.name, we get Joe. And when we call player.number, we get 20. And we can see that matches up properly. And as we saw in the earlier lesson, you want to make sure that there is a proper matching between the key values right there, the keys, and the names of the Java fields that you are trying to map the data into. So for example, if this were something like this, person, that's going to create a mismatch. Let's run this. And we can see we get an exception, unresolved compilation problem, name cannot be resolved or is not a field. So you want to make sure that things are matching up properly. If your keys in the JSON file are name, number, you want to make sure that they are getting driven into fields with the same names. There are workarounds for that, where there is a mismatch between the keys in the JSON data and the names of the fields in the Java objects, but that is a topic for a different lesson. So let's run this one more time. And now that our keys and field names match up properly again, everything's fine and the data got deserialized properly. In this lesson, we learned how to deserialize a JSON file into a Java object using Jackson's object mapper and its read value method. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to serialize a Java list into a JSON string using Jackson's object mapper and its write value as string method. Up until this point, we have been serializing and deserializing individual Java objects. Now we are going to be looking at collections of Java objects. So let's take a look at our imports. This import here allows us to use lists, and this import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper. And we have a main method. We knew the mapper object, and we have a Java list with some values in it. And then here we are calling mapper.writeValue as string. We are feeding it the Java list, and what Jackson will do is serialize that information in the list and then return that as a string. So let's run this. And we can see, let me put this all on the screen. We can see we got a nice serialization of the Java list there. And let's look a little bit more at this. Since this is a simple list, there are no key values. It's just simply values, comma separated. So that's why the JSON looks like that. In this lesson, we learned how to serialize a Java list into a JSON string using Jackson's object mapper and its writeValue as string method. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to serialize a Java map into a JSON string using Jackson's object mapper and the writeValue as string method. Let's take a look at the details. This import here allows us to use maps, and this import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper class. So we have a class named World Capitals App. It has a main method. Here is our object mapper being nude. And then we are creating a hash map where the key is the country and the value is the capital of the country. We populate the map. And then here we are going to serialize the data. We call mapper.writeValue as string, and we feed it the hash map. And then what will be returned is a JSON string. So let's run this. And let me draw this over a little bit. And we can see that we have a nice JSON string right here with the keys Japan, France, Spain, and the values Tokyo, Paris, Madrid. So it's very straightforward. You simply have to populate your hash map and then feed mapper the hash map into its writeValue as string method, and Jackson will take care of the rest for you. In this lesson, we learned how to serialize a Java map into a JSON string using Jackson's object mapper and the writeValue as string method. In this lesson, we are going to study the JSON alias annotation, which helps us resolve naming mismatches during deserialization. Let's take a look at the details. This import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper class, and this import here allows us to use the JSON alias annotation. So we have a class here named car app. There's a JSON string with key values brand name Honda, type Accord, and color red. And we knew the object mapper, and then we are going to drive that JSON string into a car object using mapper's readValue method. However, there's a problem here. This brand name, it doesn't match any field over here. And this type does not match any field over here. However, as you can see, we have workarounds. This JSON alias right here with the comma separated values brand name, brand underscore name, and my brand name, it's basically saying the following. Map this field right here onto the JSON string key value pair where we find brand, brand name, brand underscore name, or my brand name. So you're still allowed to use the original brand. If this were like this, that would be completely fine. So the proper one is still allowed, but also improper ones that don't match quite correctly, they are also allowed if they are in this comma separated list. So any of these four will map onto this field. And then down here, similarly, it's saying map the key type onto this or the original one. So up here, if it were what we wanted it to be, that's totally fine. But it could also be this if we wanted it, and that will work as well. So let's run this. And we can see that everything mapped the way we want it to. Car.brand is Honda. That's the field right there. Car.model, there's the field right there, is Accord. And car.color is red. So this is useful when the incoming JSON string does not match the way you want it to in terms of the keys. So let's review what happens if we don't have a proper matching. Let me take that alias away. Now we don't have any match. This says brand name and this says brand. That doesn't have a match, and this is not there to help us out. So we are going to get an error. Let's run this. And we can see we get an exception, unrecognized field brand name. That's up there. Because essentially, this key, brand name, Jackson's trying to map it onto some sort of field in our car class, but it can't find it. So we get an error. But now when I put the alias back, this brand name matches one of the comma-separated values right there. So everything runs just fine. In this lesson, we studied the JSON alias annotation, which helps us resolve naming mismatches during deserialization. In this lesson, we are going to study the JSON ignore annotation, which allows us to ignore fields in a Java object during serialization. Let's take a look at the details. This import up here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper class, and this import up here allows us to use the JSON ignore annotation. So we have a class here named Apple App. It's got a main method. We knew an object mapper. We knew an Apple object. The class is down there. And we populate the fields of the Apple object. And then what we are going to do is drive the contents of this Apple object into a JSON string using mapper.writeValue as string. However, in this particular example, we don't want the country of origin being driven into the JSON string. So we put the JSON ignore annotation above the country of origin field. So let's run this. And what we can see with our JSON string, we got color, red, quantity 10, because those are the fields right there with their values. But as you can see, country of origin, United States, that never made it into the JSON string. Now let me comment that out and run it again. And now we can see that all three fields from the Java object are there. So let me put the JSON ignore annotation back in play. And we can see that, once again, color and quantity made it into the JSON string, but not the country of origin field. So this is useful when you want to drive data from a Java object into a JSON string, but you want to exclude one or more fields in the Java object from making it into the JSON string. In this lesson, we studied the JSON ignore annotation, which allows us to ignore fields in a Java object during serialization. In the previous lesson, we saw how we could use Jackson's JSON ignore annotation to ignore fields in a Java object during serialization. JSON ignore can also be used to ignore fields during deserialization, and that's what this lesson is about. Let's take a look at the details. So we have a class here named Banana App. It has a main method And we have a JSON string right here. And we have an object mapper that gets newed. And we have a banana object. And what we are doing is trying to drive this JSON data into the banana object. And we do so using mapper.readValue. Now, interestingly, because JSON ignore is set up here, this quantity will not get updated. So here we can see that we would normally have quantity 20, but here the JSON will not update it. So let's run this. And let's look at the details. So Brazil, that proceeds as normal. So country of origin is Brazil. The color proceeds as normal. And then JSON ignore essentially skipped over this quantity. So the quantity stayed at 4. And interestingly, there is an extra field in here. The JSON string has country of origin, color, and quantity, but the Java object has country of origin, color, quantity, and in season. So we see that in season got preserved just fine. So you could have extra fields when you are trying to drive JSON data into that object. And if it's an extra field that is not in the JSON key value pairs, it will essentially be left alone. But what's not okay is something like this. Now what I have here is an extra field, price 95 cents. There's no price field down here. So you can have one too many Java fields or as many extra ones as you want, but you can't be starved of fields. You can't have too few. Anything in here needs to find a home somewhere in the Java object. And since price has no home in the Java object, we're going to get an error. So we can see here, unrecognized field price. That's because this price right here was looking for a home in the Java object and never found it. So let me get this back to a okay condition. Now things are fine because every key value pair in the JSON string found a home in the Java object. Country of origin maps right there, color maps right there, and quantity maps right there. In this lesson, we saw how we could use the JSON ignore annotation to ignore fields in a Java object during deserialization. Earlier in the course, we saw how to serialize single Java objects as well as collections. Now we are going to learn how to serialize Java objects that contain other Java objects using Jackson's object mapper class. Let's look at the details. So this import here allows us to use Jackson's object mapper class, and this import here allows us to use the serialization feature. So we have a class called carApp. It has a main method. We knew the object mapper, and then right here, mapper.enable, where we are feeding it serialization feature.indent output. That's for pretty printing. Basically, if you have a complex nested JSON object, it could be difficult to read. Feeding that parameter into mapper.enable will make the output easy to read. So we have a car object here, which we knew, and we feed it the data. And let's look at the details of the car object. Here we have a class called car. It's got a model, meaning the model name of the car, but then it has another Java object inside of it. It has an engine object, and the engine has the number of cylinders as well as the horsepower. So what we have done is we have populated the model of the car. It's a Ford F-150. We've also populated the data for the engine of the car. Car.engine.cylinders equals 8. So it's an 8-cylinder car. Car.engine.horsepower equals 275. So it's a 275 horsepower car. And what's nice about this is we just call mapper.writeValue as string, and feed it the car object, and Jackson will take care of serializing the whole thing. It's able to pick up the field right there, as well as this Java object here, which has its own data. So provided there's nothing unusual going on, Jackson will go right ahead and get it for you and output it as a string, which we stored in this variable right here, JSON string. So let's run this. And let me move this over a little bit. So we can see we have a really nice JSON string here. The model of the car is a Ford 150, and then it has an engine, and the number of cylinders is 8, and the horsepower is 275. So Jackson did a real nice job of serializing the whole thing. In this lesson, we learned how to serialize Java objects that contain other Java objects using Jackson's Object Mapper class. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to deserialize JSON data involving Java objects within Java objects using Jackson's Object Mapper class. Let's look at the details. This import here allows us to use Jackson's Object Mapper class. We have a class called Computer App. It has a main method. We have a JSON string here, and we have an object mapper. And then what we are doing is driving this JSON data into a computer object. So the argument on the left for mapper.readValue is the JSON string. And the argument on the right is the type of class Jackson is supposed to drive the data into. Let's look at the computer class. It has a make and a model, but it also has another Java object in it, a processor object. And that processor object has a processor name, a speed, number of cores, and a Boolean field in stock indicating whether or not the processor is in stock. So what Jackson is going to do is take the names right there, the keys and the key value pairs, and look to map them into the Java objects. So make matches up with make, model matches up with model, and my processor matches up with this Java object right here, the processor object, and then this nesting here, processor name corresponds to that. The speed corresponds to speed right there, and number of cores corresponds to number of cores. So everything maps nicely. And we also have an extra field there. That's okay, you can have an extra field. So let's run this. And we see everything maps nicely. The computer make is a Dell. The computer model is a GameMax. We're getting that right there. The processor name is an Intel i7. The processor speed is 2200. And the number of cores is 8. And the processor being in stock is true. And that got picked up right there. But what you can't do is starve the JSON data. You can't have a field in the JSON data with no home for it. Jackson's going to try to map every key value pair onto a variable somewhere. So let me take one away here. Now what's going to happen is Jackson is going to try to map this speed key value pair, but it's not going to find it. So we are going to get an error. Let's run this. And we see we get an exception, unrecognized field speed. So now let me put this back. And now everything's fine because every key here, including the nesting, has a home in this structure down here. So let's run this. And we can see everything is working fine. In this lesson, we learned how to deserialize JSON data involving Java objects within Java objects using Jackson's Object Mapper class. Thank you for taking the time to complete my Jackson Quick Start for Beginners course. In this course, You learned how you can use JSON to serialize and deserialize JSON. We used the Object Mapper class to serialize Java objects into JSON and to deserialize JSON into Java objects. We saw how JSON can serialize single objects, collections, and Java objects that contain other Java objects. We also learned how to use the serialization feature to provide output that is easily readable. We saw how mismatches between Java objects and JSON data can cause errors during deserialization, and we learned how we can avoid those errors. I hope you enjoyed the course. Please leave a review and be sure to check out my other courses. Thank you and good luck in your development efforts.